Hello, my name is Raquel Cifuentes, and I decided to do my research on gender roles in preschool children's storytelling. So the purpose of my research was to explore gender-related themes in preschool children's storytelling. And my mentor for this was Cheryl Wright. For the method section, there are 800 stories that were generated by preschool children aging from 2 to 6, and they were all enrolled in the Child and Family Development Center at the University of Utah. So for the procedure, it consisted of a teacher asking each child to individually tell them a story while the teacher wrote it down. The teacher would then notify the child that after they finished telling the story that they would be acting it out with the class. And so for them, storytelling and story drama was highly motivating for the children to tell the story. There were no prompts given to the child on what the story should be about. There was no certain subject or anything the children had to talk about, which allowed for them to use their creativity to the fullest and allowing them to just make up anything that they desired. And after the children told the stories and acted it out, then the stories were then coded for different patterns and recurring themes based on gender. And some of the data collection that we did was the number of stories told per child. So the average number of stories told ranged from 1 to 3 stories. This is the most common number of stories that each child told. So total, there were 206 children that shared stories. 106 were female and 100 were male. So it was pretty evenly distributed between gender. And on the next slide, we will be able to talk about the results that we got from coding the different patterns and recurring themes by gender. For the results section, after we were able to do the coding for the different recurring themes and patterns that were seen in the children's storytelling, one of the main themes that we found was the story structure. So females were a lot more detail-oriented, following a single plot line. And on the other hand, males had multiple storylines with no concrete plot, so their stories were more disorganized and harder to follow compared to the females, where it was clear and concise what they were talking about, and the ending came together, while males were more scattered, their thoughts were more scattered. And boys actually described their characters a lot more than females did, which I thought was interesting. So they would use big and scary and mean when describing their characters, and they also used a lot more exaggeration as well when they would speak. And they also did a lot more emphasis on aggressive animals, so they would talk a lot about bears and sharks and dinosaurs and crocodiles and lions and bigger animals like that when they were talking. And so they would talk about multiple animals and in their stories, which was really interesting. Also, another theme that I found was that the main characters in the stories were always the same gender as the child telling the story. So if a female was telling the story, it would either be a princess or it would be, the character would have a female name. It would be a female. And on the other hand, for the boys, they would use superheroes or animals that were males as well when they were telling their story, and they would be the main character. Another theme that was found was that both genders talked a lot about life and death in their stories. And they mentioned death quite often in their stories, particularly when it came to the bad guy in the story. They would, like the witch or whatever it may be, they would always die as a way of ending the story. It would always be a death of the bad person in the story, which goes along the lines of both genders talked about good versus evil storylines. So there was always the good guy and the bad guy, whether it was like the princess and Prince Charming or superheroes of any sorts. There was always the good and the bad would always, lose at the end, which usually meant that they would die, which was really interesting that both genders evenly talked about good versus evil, good versus bad, with a different range of whether it was, superheroes or princesses, but it all fell along that type of storyline. And I was able to also do a pie chart showing whether their stories were fantasy or reality. And as you can see, almost 70% of the stories were fantasy. And so it was a lot more common for the children to make up stories that were, based on whatever they liked rather than just talking about something that happened to them on a regular basis. So that was really interesting to see. And a few of them would talk about 11% would talk about both fantasy and reality in their different stories, which was really interesting. So for the discussion and summary section, I was able to see that males told stories that were a lot more violent and aggressive, and they would use words such as kicking and punching, and, crashing and fire, and words that were a lot more intense in their stories. And the most commonly used word was dinosaur, actually. So I found a really strong pattern of big aggressive animals that were constantly seen in male stories. And there was always sharks and dinosaurs and lions and bears, and just animals that were a lot more intimidating and aggressive. So that was really interesting. And on the other hand, females, they told stories that were a lot more domestic, and so they were a lot more family oriented, and they talk a lot about mom and dad and baby and siblings, and they would talk about getting married and having a family and living happily ever after. And so with that, the most commonly used word was princess. So the stories would talk about a princess and the prince coming and saving them from the bad guy, and then they would kiss and get married and live happily ever after. And that was really common in the female stories. They would use a lot of different words that were more like pretty butterfly or beautiful gown, and those were more the descriptive words versus the males that were a lot more aggressive in their storytelling. So some of the limitations for this study were, due to COVID-19, I was originally going to collect my own stories at the FCS department at the daycare and be able to just start fresh with new stories for the semester, but because of that, we weren't able to. But thankfully, the strength was that my mentor had already collected a data set that had a large amount of stories from male and female students that I was able to read through and encode and find the different patterns for. So that was really, really great that we were able to do that. So the results, they are consistent with the previous research, which indicating similar gender-associated themes in preschool children's storytelling. So past research, would support that children were showing gender stereotyped attitudes towards toys. So they would associate dolls with girls a lot faster than they would associate it with boys. And that kind of goes along the lines of the results that we found for this study, and that there are significant and obvious gender themes in these stories. And it shows the most because these stories are completely made up by the child with no prompting at all from anyone. So it's just what they wanted to talk about and their creative aspect. And so it was really interesting to see how much gender played a role in their storytelling. But yeah, it was really awesome.